Hello and welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, hi, you're very welcome. This is Reading the Past and I'm Dr. Cat. So this video is going to go live on the Friday just before Halloween. And this month, we've been looking at a few of the more macabre stories from the past. I'd argue that today's topic also fits within this macabre theme, as it features treasonous plots, torture, and execution. In a show of almost unheard of forward planning from me, it also fits beautifully with a big night for the UK that will be coming up the next Friday, so the first Friday in November. And as has become customary, on this channel, first Fridays are for looking over the history news headlines from the preceding month. So it's not like I'd be putting out this video on the actual day in question. And it's also not like we won't be spending the next 7 days chanting the following, whether out loud or in our own heads. Remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot. So, let's talk Guy Fawkes and his barrels of gunpowder. After the more famous opening line of remember the 5th of November, gunpowder, treason and plot, the poem goes on. We see no reason why gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. Guy Fawkes, 'twas his intent to blow up king and parliament. 70 barrels were laid below to prove old England's overthrow. By God's mercy, he was catched with a darkened lantern and burning match. So holla boys, let the bells ring. Holla boys, God save the king. There are also various endings for this poem, with one being, and what shall we do with him? Burn him. While another calls for a rope to hang the Pope, and another goes, a penny loaf to feed the Pope, a farthing a cheese to choke him, a pint of beer to rinse it down, a faggot of sticks to burn him in a tub of tar, burn him like a blazing star, burn his body from his head, then we'll say, old Pope is dead. Hip hip hurrah, hip hip hurrah, hip hip hurrah. If you ever have cause to be in Lewes, in East Sussex on Bonfire Night, stuff gets pretty wild with the old burning of various people in effigy. Contemporary popes, politicians and reality TV stars are just some of the examples of those who have received this particular kind of treatment. The effigy burning has, however, more commonly and characteristically been focused at the guy. In the run-up to November 5th, local children will construct a normally fairly unsettling humanoid structure out of a concoction of rags and straw that they then push around the streets in a purloined shopping trolley. The whole thing has the appearance of a deboned scarecrow and is equally haunting in the twilight hours. The youths will call out for a penny for the guy. The earnings may be given to charity or, I think, presumably spent to appease whatever hellspawn might be drawn to animate this guy in order to discourage it from murdering us all in our sleep. The children don't tend to discuss that last part. Then, on the big night itself, Bonfire Night, November 5th, one of these guys will often be found atop a pyre in a local park ready to be burnt, while fireworks are set off in celebration. We are a totally normal country. The guy in question relates to Guy Fawkes, and this connection has led many to a misunderstanding about the gunpowder plot, specifically how central Guy Fawkes was to it, how in charge of the whole thing he was. But before we get there, let's skip back to the 24th of March 1603 and the date of Queen Elizabeth I's death at Richmond Palace. She was almost 70 years old, and she had ruled her nation for 45 years. Her successor would now have to be informed. The messenger was to be Robert Carey, the son of Henry Carey, who was himself the first cousin and, depending on where his mother Mary Boleyn's relationship was with King Henry VIII at the time of his conception, possibly also the half-brother of the now deceased Queen Elizabeth I. So when Elizabeth died, it was her first cousin once removed, possibly her secret nephew Robert Carey, who departed from Richmond and rode without stopping to reach the new King of England, James VI of Scots, to inform him of his new title. James was at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh, nearly 400 miles from Richmond. Robert Carey made it there in just 2 days, arriving on the 26th of March 1603. James was a relatively unknown quantity, upon whom various factions in England could pin their hopes and dreams. And that isn't to say that he did nothing to encourage those hopes before Elizabeth's death, because in some cases he certainly did. Elizabeth had begun her reign against the flaming backdrop of her sister's Counter-Reformation. At the start, Elizabeth asserted that she did not wish to, quote, make windows into men's souls. She may be the Protestant supreme governor of the English Church, but at least at the beginning, Roman Catholics might dare to hope to be left to their private devotions. As the reign continued, various plots and the excommunication piled on top of each other in such a way that Elizabeth and her ministers began to wonder whether it was possible to be both, to be a faithful Roman Catholic and also loyal to the Queen. Roman Catholic worship started to be viewed as a portal through which treason could enter the realm, and as such, it was studiously curtailed with the use of hefty fines. But rather than burn and make martyrs as her sister had done, Elizabeth's priest hunters found traitors who would be executed in the customary way. James VI of Scots, although a Protestant, Presbyterian to be exact, had a wife with known Catholic sympathies. There were rumours that Anne of Denmark had even secretly converted to the faith, and at their joint English coronation, she publicly refused to take Anglican communion. No doubt, this must have enhanced the hopes for toleration from the Roman Catholics resident in England. In earlier years, between 1595 and 1596, James had sent John Ogilvy to the continent, to Rome and Madrid, with pronouncements of the Scottish king's apparent interest in potentially, maybe, converting to the Roman Catholic faith. The reality of this desire is highly doubtful. Rather, I think it might safely be assumed to have been simply a ploy, designed to allow his assumed future accession to the English throne to proceed without Spanish interference. Also, for a few years before Elizabeth's death, James was in contact with leading crypto-Catholic or Catholic sympathising nobles, people like the Earl of Northampton, Henry Howard, and the Earl of Northumberland, Henry Percy. James would make many of the right noises about toleration for Roman Catholics in the years before he became King of England, but tellingly, he formally committed to nothing. Within months of James's accession, there were already plots against his rule in England. In the late summer of 1603, the so-called Main Plot intended to replace James with his cousin Arbella or Arabella Stuart. This was allegedly funded by Spain. That summer had also seen the discovery of the so-called By Plot, which referred to a conspiracy to kidnap King James in order to force him to provide greater toleration for Roman Catholics in English law. Had James ever actually felt inclined to loosen the constraints on Catholics in England? No doubt. these plots would have forced him to pause and reassess at the very least. Things looked bleaker in the aftermath of the Hampton Court Conference of January 1604, in which James upheld the royal supremacy, the Articles of Religion, and the use of the Book of Common Prayer. It also looks like he was recognising or acknowledging Roman Catholicism as a potential enemy within. Unsurprisingly, many Roman Catholics in England braced themselves for suppression, fines, and even accusations of treason. A few attempted to solve the problem. Robert Catesby had hoped that Spain might be encouraged to intervene militarily in support of their co-religionists in England, but he would soon see that Spain wanted peace with England instead. If things were going to change for Roman Catholics in England, it looked like they were going to have to do something about it themselves. According to the confession of one of Catesby's co-conspirators, Thomas Winter, this is the chain of events that led up to an attempt to blow up Parliament, and with it, the King. Catesby had, according to Winter, summoned him to London at the start of 1604 to discuss his plans to blow up the Parliament House. Also present at this meeting was one John Wright. At this stage, the plan was not set in stone, however. Instead, Thomas Winter was on the continent in the early months of 1604 to sound out the possibility of that Spanish military intervention. But once it was clear to him that peace was Spain's intention, Winter instead approached a soldier who had already been willing to serve the Roman Catholic cause for England, Guy Fawkes. This pair returned to London to meet with Catesby in April 1604. Also at the meeting was Thomas Percy, the cousin of Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland. In May 1604, Thomas Percy was tasked with renting a house that was adjacent to Parliament. Guy Fawkes, posing as Percy's man or caretaker, would collect the keys and lodge in these premises under the pseudonym John Johnson. The plan originally entailed mining from the cellar of the rented property to beneath the Palace of Westminster. Catesby was storing gunpowder and mining tools at his house in Lambeth until the various moments that each of these things would be needed, at which time they would be brought under cover of darkness by yet another conspirator, Robert Keyes. Work on this tunnel had paused with the prorogation of Parliament, and then it stopped again because the lodgings above their cellar had been commandeered to house the Scottish commissioners who were negotiating the proposed union between England and Scotland. At the start of February 1605, the gunpowder was finally rowed over from Lambeth to be stored in the property that had been rented by Thomas Percy. The conspirators then resumed their tunnelling, but progress had seemingly become worryingly slow, so more conspirators were inducted into the plot in order to help with the tunnelling. There was Christopher Wright, the brother of the John from Thomas Winter's first meeting with Catesby. There was Winter's own brother, Robert, he was brought in too, along with a third man, John Grant. And at some point, Thomas Bates, a servant of Catesby, was also brought into the knowledge of what this group had planned. As they got on with their seemingly interminable tunnelling, a noise from nearby drew their collective attention. Guy Fawkes, masquerading as John Johnson, was, I assume, voluntold to go and investigate. He returned with the surprising and I'm sure very welcome news that someone was moving out of the premises that were located directly below the Lord's Chamber. At once, Thomas Percy went and rented this recently vacated and much more helpfully located space, with no further need for digging. The gunpowder could be stored in this new space, and all they had to do was wait for the opportune moment to enact their scheme. The group, I think fairly sensibly, left London to do this waiting. Guy Fawkes even left England. He spent the period between Easter and August 1605 in Flanders, keeping a low profile. At the same time, he was also seeking support for his co-conspirators' plots from those on the continent. Catesby wasn't idle either. He used the time to seek out yet more conspirators. This time he was looking for people with capital, those who might be able and willing to fund any fighting that might have to take place after the Parliament had been destroyed and the king had been killed. According to Thomas Winter, Catesby convened with Thomas Percy and then approached Sir Everard Digby, Ambrose Rookwood and Francis Tresham to come on board as those wealthy benefactors for their scheme. Parliament was once again prorogued on the 3rd of October, and it was set to reconvene just over a month later on the 5th of November. Thomas Winter was actually at this ceremonial prorogation. He was in the company of the Lord Monteagle. It's often been pointed out that Winter must have taken great comfort in seeing the great and the good all in attendance alongside him, because it would have shown him that clearly all these people had absolutely no awareness of the mountain of explosives that were being stored beneath their feet. Seemingly, the intention was, when Parliament reconvened, that this mound of gunpowder would be set off. The plotters assumed that both King James and his son and heir Henry would be killed by the blast. Thomas Percy offered to use his position within the king's troop of bodyguards to get close enough in order to abduct the next in line, Prince Charles, presumably to rule through him as a puppet king. A safer bet, in the minds of the rest of the conspirators, was, however, to spark a rebellion in the Midlands which could be used as a cover to abduct Charles's sister Elizabeth, in order to rule through her instead, and, in the future, when she was old enough, to put her in a marriage with a usefully Catholic foreign prince. Interestingly, just who the plotters intended to hand her and her new crown over to as a protector or regent was never disclosed. And I find it hard to believe that they had nobody in mind. In fact, for me, it beggars belief that they wouldn't have approached someone and, I think, received the go-ahead. But if they did, this is someone who they were prepared to protect at all costs. So much so that this individual and their very existence remains unknown to us today. Things started going awry fairly quickly. As November the 5th approached, the plotters learned that Prince Henry would not be joining his father at the Palace of Westminster. Then, on the evening of the 27th of October, Thomas Winter was visited by a member of the Lord Monteagle's household, at which point he was informed, quote, that a letter had been given to my Lord Monteagle to this effect, that he wished his lordship's absence from the Parliament because a blow would there be given, which letter he, Monteagle, presently carried to my Lord of Salisbury. The entire royal court was thus made aware of the existence of a potential plot. Guy Fawkes was sent, presumably, once again, he's been voluntold, to go and see if he could find any evidence that anyone had discovered their stash of gunpowder. He determined that nothing had been disturbed. To his mind, they were safe to carry on. Thomas Winter and Robert Catesby met with Francis Tresham on the 1st of November at Barnet, and there they accused him of betraying them with that letter of warning to Monteagle. This was a charge that he fervently denied. However, Francis Tresham had been vocally opposed to Catesby's plot. He had tried to talk him and indeed buy him out of it. At this point, Thomas Winter was apparently of a mind to call off the scheme entirely. But instead, on the 3rd of November, Catesby and Winter met with Thomas Percy, who had just returned from the north. Percy offered to test the proverbial waters by visiting with his cousin, Henry Percy, Earl of Northumberland. He said he'd go the next day and dine with him. Thomas Percy was not detained. He came back and reported that all seemed well. The plot, as far as he was concerned, could safely continue. Duly, Guy Fawkes was given the go-ahead to take up his position with the gunpowder in the cellar below the House of Lords. On the afternoon of the 4th of November, the Lord Chamberlain, who at this time was the Earl of Suffolk, began his customary inspection of the house and of the cellars beneath it with a small group that on this occasion included the Lord Monteagle, the recipient of that very warning letter. Unsurprisingly, they met Guy Fawkes, who was still posing as John Johnson, and the group saw his large store of firewood and other fuel, all of which was being used to hide those barrels and barrels of gunpowder. The group of inspectors inquired who owned the contents of the room. They were informed and went on their way. But the interaction clearly stayed with Monteagle, even if it was only subconsciously, because when he was back at court and back before his king, he commented with surprise that Thomas Percy, with whom he was acquainted, had this peculiar rented property beneath the Palace of Westminster. Monteagle also mentioned that Thomas Percy was a Roman Catholic, and that was sufficient. King James ordered that the vaults be searched again. At around midnight, the keeper of the Palace of Westminster, Sir Thomas Knivet, accompanied by a search party, encountered Guy Fawkes. They apparently found it odd that he was still there, still fully dressed and still in his boots at that time of night. It was sufficiently odd that Fawkes was detained. The stock of wood and other fuel that he was seemingly guarding was moved, and 36 barrels of gunpowder were uncovered. Reportedly, that is almost 1 ton of explosive. However, when this stockpile was examined after it had been discovered and seized, it was found to be decayed. Apparently, it had stood idle for too long, and when that happens, gunpowder loses its explosive quality. So the thought process is that even if these barrels of gunpowder had not been discovered, the likelihood is that they would not have been capable of doing any damage had they been ignited on the 5th of November anyway. Nevertheless, the intention was there. The presence of the gunpowder was evidence of treason, and through this discovery, Guy Fawkes and Thomas Percy's guilt were thought to be evident. But the authorities only had their hands on Fawkes, so it would be him that they questioned. According to his interrogators, Guy Fawkes showed remarkable resolve. Apart from the already identified Thomas Percy, he refused to name anyone else. He didn't even give his interrogators his real name until they presented him with a letter from one of his pockets that was addressed to Mr. Fawkes, and that disclosure took until the 7th of November. King James reportedly gave permission to use torture on Fawkes in order to extract information about the seemingly ongoing threat to the crown. The king is said to have specified that the gentler tortures be the starting point, proceeding to the worst. For 2 more days, the 8th and 9th respectively, these inducements failed to generate anything that was really that useful. And we don't know the exact methods that Fawkes was subjected to, but we can certainly see what looks like the effect of them on his signature. On the left is his signature at a time when he is thought to have been subjected to torture, and on the right, according to the National Archives, is a version of his signature from 8 days later, presumably once he had had a chance to recover slightly. While he was being questioned, Fawkes' colleagues in Treason were trying to foment rebellion among their fellow Catholics in the Midlands. Towards the end, they were resting at the home of Stephen Littleton, and for some unknown reason, they were attempting to dry their gunpowder in front of a fire. This was happening on the evening of the 7th of November. Apparently, on this occasion, the gunpowder was in fact quite dry enough, as it exploded and it injured some of them fairly severely. Among the injured were Ambrose Rookwood, Henry Morgan, John Grant, and Robert Catesby. Thomas Winter returned to this scene of chaos, having been on an ultimately futile trip to attempt to rouse members of the local gentry to follow their cause. The next morning, the 8th of November, these rebels made their very last stand. Robert Catesby and Thomas Percy were shot dead. John Wright and his brother Christopher Wright were also shot dead, and Thomas Winter took a crossbow bolt to the shoulder, but ultimately survived. Those that the state were able to identify as being involved in the treason, who were still alive, were captured and taken to the Tower of London. They would be held there until the following January 1606, all except for Francis Tresham, who had died from an illness on the 23rd of December 1605 while a prisoner in the Tower. On the 27th of January 1606, Thomas Bates, Robert Winter, Guy Fawkes, Thomas Winter, Sir Everard Digby, John Grant, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes were tried together for treason in Westminster Hall. They were all convicted and sentenced to the customary traitor's death of being hanged, drawn, and quartered. 3 days later, on the 30th of January, Sir Everard Digby, Robert Winter, John Grant, and Thomas Bates were conveyed to Paul's Churchyard for their executions. The next day, the 31st of January, saw the rest: Guy Fawkes, Thomas Winter, Ambrose Rookwood, and Robert Keyes suffer in likewise fashion at Westminster. But it is Guy Fawkes that is remembered. He is the name of the gunpowder plot. So much of the story is obscured. Even this engraving, which depicts more of the conspirators, seems skewed. Catesby, who is arguably the chief among the traitors, stands off to the side, his back almost turned towards us, hand on hip, as if listening and or being led by others. I would argue that this engraving is placing Thomas Percy as chief conspirator with Guy Fawkes at his side, which is perhaps understandable. I would say that Percy was Catesby's co-leader of choice, and that Percy was also inextricably linked to Fawkes, as he was posing as John Johnson, Percy's caretaker, when he was arrested. So it's possible that Percy was being viewed as the true ringleader in around 1605 when this piece was being created. Alternatively, the creator is actively attempting to downplay Catesby's role for some reason. But what do you think about the way history remembers this event, or about how we celebrate it? As always, I'm looking forward to reading your conversations in the comments section underneath this video, or you can find me on social media. I'll leave links to the other places you can find me on the internet in my description box. Follow me over on some or all of them so we can continue this conversation and start some others. I do hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. If you did, why not share it with your friends? Please also let me know you liked it by hitting the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel, and if you think you're subscribed, please do have a little check now. Make sure that YouTube hasn't mysteriously unsubscribed you. While you're there, checking, subscribing, maybe resubscribing, why not hit the bell icon beside the subscribe button and then select all in the drop down so that YouTube tells you when I've next uploaded. I hope you're going to have a great day, whatever you're doing, and I look forward to speaking to you all in my next video. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye for now.